I had the honor to dine with the governor, where a new set of ghosts served up the meat and waited at table. I now observed myself to be less terrified than I had been in the morning. I stayed till sunset, but humbly desired His Highness to excuse me for not accepting his invitation of lodging in the palace. My two friends and I lay at a private house in the town adjoining, which is the capital of this little island, and the next morning we returned to pay our duty to the governor, as he was pleased to command us. After this manner we continued in the island for 10 days, most part of every day with the governor, and at night in our lodging. I soon grew so familiarized to the sight of spirits that after the 3rd or 4th time they gave me no emotion at all, or, if I had any apprehensions left, my curiosity prevailed over them, for His Highness the Governor ordered me to call up whatever persons I would choose to name, and in whatever numbers among the dead from the beginning of the world to the present time, and command them to answer any questions I should think fit to ask, with this condition, that my questions must be confined within the compass of the times they lived in, and one thing I might depend upon, that they would certainly tell me the truth, for lying was a talent of no use in the lower world. I made my humble acknowledgments to His Highness for so great a favor. We were in a chamber from whence there was a fair prospect into the park, and because my first inclination was to be entertained with scenes of pomp and magnificence, I desired to see Alexander the Great at the head of his army just after the battle of Arbela, which, upon a motion of the governor's finger, immediately appeared in a large field under the window where we stood. Alexander was called up into the room. It was with great difficulty that I understood his Greek, and had but little of my own. He assured me upon his honor that he was not poisoned, but died of a bad fever by excessive drinking. Next I saw Hannibal passing the Alps, who told me he had not a drop of vinegar in his camp. I saw Caesar and Pompey at the head of their troops, just ready to engage. I saw the former in his last great triumph. I desired that the Senate of Rome might appear before me in one large chamber, and a modern representative in counter-view in another. The first seemed to be an assembly of heroes and demigods, the other a knot of peddlers, pickpockets, highwaymen, and bullies. The governor, at my request, gave the sign for Caesar and Brutus to advance towards us. I was struck with a profound veneration at the sight of Brutus, and could easily discover the most consummate virtue, the greatest intrepidity and firmness of mind, the truest love of his country, and general benevolence of mankind in every lineament of his countenance. I observed with much pleasure that these two persons were in good intelligence with each other, and Caesar freely confessed to me that the greatest actions of his own life were not equal by many degrees to the glory of taking it away. I had the honor to have much conversation with Brutus, and was told that his ancestor Junius, Socrates, Epaminondas, Cato the Younger, Sir Thomas More, and himself were perpetually together, a sextumvirate to which all the ages of the world cannot add a 7th. It would be tedious to trouble the listener with relating what vast numbers of illustrious persons were called up to gratify that insatiable desire I had to see the world in every period of antiquity placed before me. I chiefly fed mine eyes with beholding the destroyers of tyrants and usurpers, and the restorers of liberty to oppressed and injured nations. But it is impossible to express the satisfaction I received in my own mind after such a manner as to make it a suitable entertainment to the listener. Desirous to see those ancients who were most renowned for wit and learning, I set apart one day on purpose. I proposed that Homer and Aristotle might appear at the head of all their commentators. But these were so numerous that some hundreds were forced to attend in the court and outward rooms of the palace. I knew and could distinguish those two heroes at first sight, not only from the crowd, but from each other. Homer was the taller and comelier person of the two, walked very erect for one of his age, and his eyes were the most quick and piercing I ever beheld. Aristotle stooped much, and made use of a staff. His visage was meagre, his hair lank and thin, and his voice hollow. I soon discovered that both of them were perfect strangers to the rest of the company, and had never seen or heard of them before, and I had a whisper from a ghost who shall be nameless, that these commentators always kept in the most distant quarters from their principals in the lower world, through a consciousness of shame and guilt, because they had so horribly misrepresented the meaning of those authors to posterity. I introduced Didymus and Eustathius to Homer, and prevailed upon him to treat them better than perhaps they deserved, for he soon found they wanted a genius to enter into the spirit of a poet. But Aristotle was out of all patience with the account I gave him of Scotus and Ramus, as I presented them to him, and he asked them whether the rest of the tribe were as great dunces as themselves. I then desired the governor to call up Descartes and Gassendi, with whom I prevailed to explain their systems to Aristotle. This great philosopher freely acknowledged his own mistakes in natural philosophy, because he proceeded in many things upon conjecture, as all men must do, and he found that Gassendi, who had made the doctrine of Epicurus as palatable as he could, and the vortices of Descartes, were equally to be exploded. He predicted the same fate to attraction, whereof the present learned are such zealous assertors. He said that new systems of nature were but new fashions, which would vary in every age, and even those who pretend to demonstrate them from mathematical principles would flourish but a short period of time, and be out of vogue when that was determined. I spent 5 days in conversing with many others of the ancient learned. I saw most of the first Roman emperors. I prevailed on the governor to call up Heliogabalus's cooks to dress us at dinner, but they could not show us much of their skill for want of materials. A helot of Agesilaus made us a dish of Spartan broth, but I was not able to get down a second spoonful. The 2 gentlemen who conducted me to the island were pressed by their private affairs to return in 3 days, which I employed in seeing some of the modern dead, who had made the greatest figure for 200 or 300 years past in our own and other countries of Europe. And having been always a great admirer of old illustrious families, I desired the governor would call up a dozen or 2 of kings with their ancestors in order for 8 or 9 generations. But my disappointment was grievous and unexpected. For instead of a long train with royal diadems, I saw in one family 2 fiddlers, 3 spruce courtiers, and an Italian prelate. In another, a barber, an abbot, and 2 cardinals. I have too great a veneration for crowned heads to dwell any longer on so nice a subject. But as to counts, marquises, dukes, earls, and the like, I was not so scrupulous. And I confess it was not without some pleasure that I found myself able to trace the particular features by which certain families are distinguished up to their originals. I could plainly discover whence one family derives a long chin, why a second has abounded with knaves for 2 generations, and fools for 2 more, why a third happened to be crack-brained, and a 4th to be sharpers. Whence it came. What Polydore Vigil says of a certain great house, nec vir fortis, nec femina casta. How cruelty, falsehood, and cowardice grew to be characteristics by which certain families are distinguished as much as by their coats of arms. Neither could I wonder at all this when I saw such an interruption of lineages by pages, lackeys, valets, coachmen, gamesters, fiddlers, players, captains, and pickpockets. How low an opinion I had of human wisdom and integrity when I was truly informed of the springs and motives of great enterprises and revolutions in the world, and of the contemptible accidents to which they owed their success. Leave of His Highness the Governor of Glubbdubdrib having been obtained, I returned with my 2 companions to Maldonada, where, after a fortnight's waiting, a ship was ready to sail for Luggnagg. The 2 gentlemen and some others were so generous and kind as to furnish me with provisions and see me on board. I was a month on this voyage, We had one violent storm, and were under a necessity of steering westward to get into the trade wind, which holds for about 60 leagues. On the 21st of April, 1708, we sailed into the river of Clymacnig, which is a seaport town at the southeast port of Lugnag. We cast anchor within a league of the town, and made a signal for the pilot. 2 of them came on board in less than half an hour, by whom we were guided between certain shoals and rocks, which are very dangerous in the passage, to a large basin where a fleet may ride in safety within a cable's length of a town wall. Some of our sailors, whether out of treachery or inadvertence, had informed the pilots that I was a stranger and a great traveler, whereof these gave notice to a custom-house officer, by whom I was examined very strictly upon my landing. This officer spoke to me in the language of Balnibarbi, which, by the force of much commerce, is generally understood in that town, especially by seamen and those employed in the customs. I gave him a short account of some particulars, and made my story as plausible and consistent as I could, but I thought it necessary to disguise my country and call myself a Hollander, because my intentions were for Japan, and I knew the Dutch were the only Europeans permitted to enter into that kingdom. I therefore told the officer that, having been shipwrecked on the coast of Balnibarbi and cast on a rock, I was received into Laputa, or the Flying Island, of which he had often heard, and was now endeavoring to get to Japan, whence I might find a convenience of returning to my own country. The officer said I must be confined till he could receive orders from court, for which he would write immediately, and hope to receive an answer in a fortnight. I was carried to a convenient lodging, with a sentry placed at the door. However, I had the liberty of a large garden, and was treated with humanity enough, being maintained all the time at the king's charge. I was visited by several persons, chiefly from out of curiosity, because it was reported that I had come from countries very remote, of which they had never heard. I hired a young man, who was in the same ship, to be an interpreter. He was a native of Lugnag, but had lived some years at Maldonada, and was a perfect master of both languages. By his assistance, I was able to hold a conversation with those who came to visit me, but this consisted only of their questions and my answers. The dispatch came from court about the time we expected. It contained a warrant for conducting me and my retinue to Traldragdub, or Trildrugdrib, for it is pronounced both ways as near as I can remember, by a party of 10 horse. All my retinue was that poor lad for an interpreter, whom I persuaded into my service, and, at my humble request, we had each of us a mule to ride on. A messenger was dispatched, half a day's journey before us, to give the king notice of my approach, and to desire that his majesty would please to appoint a day and hour when it would be his gracious pleasure that I might have the honor to lick the dust before his footstool. This is the court style, and I found it to be more than a matter of form, for upon my admittance 2 days after my arrival, I was commanded to crawl upon my belly and lick the floor as I advanced. But on account of my being a stranger, care was taken to have it made so clean that the dust was not offensive. However, this was a peculiar grace, not allowed to any but persons of the highest rank when they desire an admittance. Nay, sometimes the floor is strewed with dust on purpose, when the person to be admitted happens to have powerful enemies at court, and I have seen a great lord with his mouth so crammed that when he had crept to the proper distance from the throne, he was not able to speak a word. Neither is there any remedy, because it is capital for those who receive an audience to spit or wipe their mouths in his majesty's presence. There is indeed another custom which I cannot altogether approve of. When the king has a mind to put any of his nobles to death in a gentle, indulgent manner, he commands the floor to be strewed with a certain brown powder of deadly composition, which, being licked up, infallibly kills him in 24 hours. But in justice to this prince's great clemency, and the care he has of his subjects' lives, it must be mentioned for his honor that strict orders are given to have the infected parts of the floor well washed after every such execution, which, if his domestics neglect, they are in danger of incurring his royal displeasure. I myself heard him give directions that one of his pages should be whipped, whose turn it was to give notice about washing the floor after an execution, but maliciously had omitted it, by which neglect a young lord of great hopes, coming to an audience, was unfortunately poisoned, although the king at that time had no design against his life. But this good prince was so gracious as to forgive the poor page his whipping, upon promise that he would do so no more without special orders. To return from this digression, when I had crept within 4 yards of the throne, I raised myself gently upon my knees, and then, striking my forehead 7 times against the ground, I pronounced the following words, as they had been taught me the night before. Inkpling, glaftrub, squat, scrum, hjop, mlashnalt, swin, trodback, skufslab, pad, gordlub, asht. This is the compliment established by the laws of the land for all persons admitted to the king's presence. It may be rendered in English thus: May your celestial majesty outlive the sun 11 moons and a half. To this the king returned some answer, which, although I could not understand, yet I replied as I had been directed. Flute, drin yaleric, dwuldom, prastrad, mirpush, which properly signifies, my tongue is in the mouth of my friend. By this expression was meant that I desired leave to bring my interpreter, whereupon the young man, already mentioned, was accordingly introduced, by whose intervention I answered as many questions as his majesty could put in above an hour. I spoke in the Balnibarbian tongue, and my interpreter delivered my meaning in that of Lugnag. The king was much delighted with my company, and ordered his Blifmarklub, or High Chamberlain, to appoint a lodging in the court for me and my interpreter, with a daily allowance for my table, and a large purse of gold for my common expenses. I stayed 3 months in this country, out of perfect obedience to his majesty, who was pleased highly to favor me, and made me very honorable offers, but I thought it more consistent with prudence and justice to pass the remainder of my days with my wife and family. Lugnagians are polite and generous, and although they are not without some share of that pride which is peculiar to all eastern countries, yet they show themselves courteous to strangers, at least to such who are countenanced by the court. I had many acquaintances, and among persons of the best fashion, and being always attended by my interpreter, the conversation we had was not disagreeable. One day, in much good company, I was asked by a person of quality whether I had seen any of their Struldbrugs, or immortals. I said I had not, and desired he would explain to me what he meant by such an appellation, applied to a mortal creature. He told me that sometimes, though very rarely, a child happened to be born in a family with a red circular spot in the forehead, directly over the left eyebrow, which was an infallible mark that it should never die. The spot, as he described it, was about the compass of a silver 3pence, but in the course of time grew larger and changed its color. For at 12 years old it became green, so continued till 25, then turned to a deep blue. At 45 it grew coal black, and as large as an English shilling, but never admitted many farther alteration. He said these births were so rare that he did not believe that there could be 1100 Struldbrugs of both sexes in the whole kingdom, of which he computed about 50 in the metropolis, and among the rest a young girl born about 3 years ago, that these productions were not peculiar to any family, but a mere effect of chance, and the children of the Struldbrugs themselves were equally mortal with the rest of the people. I freely own myself to have been struck with inexpressible delight upon hearing this account, and the person who gave it me, happening to understand the Balnibarbian language, which I spoke very well, I could not forbear breaking out into expressions perhaps a little too extravagant. I cried out, as in a rapture, "Happy nation, where every child has at least a chance for being immortal! Happy people, who enjoy so many living examples of ancient virtue, and have masters ready to instruct them in the wisdom of former ages. But happiest, beyond all comparison, are those excellent immortals who, being born exempt from that universal calamity of human nature, have their minds free and disengaged without the weight and depression of spirits caused by the continual apprehension of death. I discovered my admiration that I had not observed any of these illustrious persons at court, the black spot on the forehead being so remarkable a distinction that I could not have easily overlooked it, and it was impossible that His Majesty, a most judicious prince, should not provide himself with a good number of such wise and able counselors. Yet perhaps the virtue of those reverend sages was too strict for the corrupt and libertine manners of a court. And we often find by experience that young men are too opinionated and volatile to be guided by the sober dictates of their seniors. However, since the king was pleased to allow me access to his royal person, I was resolved, upon the very first occasion, to deliver my opinion to him on this matter freely and at large by the help of my interpreter. And whether he would please to take my advice or not, yet in one thing I was determined, that His Majesty having frequently offered me an establishment in this country, I would, with great thankfulness, accept the favor, and pass my life here in the conversation of those superior beings, the Struldbrugs, if they would please to admit me. Then the same gentleman said that this breed of Struldbrugs was peculiar to their country, for there were no such people in Balnibarbi or Japan, where he had the honor to be ambassador from His Majesty, and found the natives in both those kingdoms very hard to believe that the fact was possible. And it appeared, from my astonishment, when he first mentioned the matter to me, that I received it as a thing wholly new and scarcely to be credited, that in the two kingdoms mentioned, where during his residence he had conversed very much, he observed long life to be the universal desire and wish of mankind, that whoever had one foot in the grave was sure to hold back the other as strongly as he could, that the oldest had still hopes of living one day longer, and looked on death as the greatest evil, from which nature always prompted him to retreat. Only in this island of Lugnag the appetite for living was not so eager, from the continual example of the Struldbrugs before their eyes. After this preface, he gave me a particular account of the immortals among them. He said, "They commonly acted like mortals till about 30 years old, after which by degrees they grew melancholy and dejected, increasing in both till they came to 80. This he learned from their own confession, for otherwise, there not being above 2 or 3 of that species born in an age, there were too few to form a general observation by. When they came to 80 years, which is reckoned the extremity of living in this country, they had not only all the follies and infirmities of other older men, but many more, which arose from the dreadful prospect of never dying. They were not only opinionative, peevish, covetous, morose, vain, talkative, but incapable of friendship, and dead to all natural affection, which never descended below their grandchildren. Envy and impotent desires are their prevailing passions. But those objects against which their envy seems principally directed are the vices of the younger sort and the deaths of the old. By reflecting on the former, they find themselves cut off from all possibility of pleasure. And whenever they see a funeral, they lament and repine that others are gone to a harbor of rest to which they themselves never can hope to arrive. They have no remembrance of anything but what they learned and observed in their youth and middle age, and even that is very imperfect, and, for the truth of particulars of any fact, it is safer to depend on common tradition than upon the best of their recollections. The least miserable among them appear to be those who turn to dotage and entirely lose their memories. These meet with more pity and assistance, because they want many bad qualities which abound in others. As soon as they have completed the term of 80 years, they are looked on as dead in law. Their heirs immediately succeed to their estates. Only a small pittance is reserved for their support, and the poor ones are maintained at the public charge. After that period, they are held incapable of any employment of trust or profit. They cannot purchase lands or take leases, neither are they allowed to be witnesses in any cause, either civil or criminal, not even for the decision of meres and bounds. At 90, they lose their teeth and hair. They have at that age no distinction of taste, but eat and drink whatever they can without relish or appetite. The diseases they were subject to still continue without increasing or diminishing. In talking, they forget the common appellation of things, and the names of persons, even of those who are their nearest friends and relations. For the same reason, they never can amuse themselves with reading, because their memory will not serve to carry them from the beginning of a sentence to the end, and by this defect they are deprived of the only entertainment they otherwise might be capable. The language of this country being always upon the flux, the Struldbrugs of one age do not understand those of another. Neither are they able, after 200 years, to hold any conversation, farther than by a few words, with their neighbors, the mortals, and thus they lie under the disadvantage of living like foreigners in their own country. This was the account given me of the Struldbrugs, as near as I can remember. I afterwards saw 5 or 6 of different ages, the youngest not above 200 years old, who were brought to me at several times by some of my friends, but although they were told that I was a great traveler and had seen all the world, they had not the least curiosity to ask me a question, only desired I would give them a token of remembrance, which is a modest way of begging to avoid the law that strictly forbids it, because they are provided for by the public, although indeed with a very scanty allowance. They are despised and hated by all sorts of people. When one of them is born, it is reckoned ominous, and their birth is recorded very particularly, so that you may know their age by consulting the register, which, however, has not been kept above 1,000 years past, or at least has been destroyed by time or public disturbances. But the usual way of computing how old they are is by asking them what kings or great persons they can remember, and then consulting history, for infallibly the last prince in their mind did not begin his reign after they were 80 years old. They were the most mortifying sights I ever beheld, and the women were more horrible than the men. Besides the usual deformities in extreme old age, they acquired an additional ghastliness in proportion to their number of years, which is not to be described, and among 6 I soon distinguished which was the eldest, although there was not above a century or 2 between them. The listener will easily believe that, from what I had heard and seen, my appetite for perpetuity of life was much abated. I grew heartily ashamed of the pleasing visions I had formed, and thought no tyrant could invent a death into which I would not run with pleasure from such a life. The king heard all that had passed between me and my friends on this occasion, and rallied me very pleasantly, wishing I could send a couple of Struldbrugs to my own country to arm our people against the fear of death. But this, it seems, is forbidden by the fundamental laws of the kingdom, or else I should have been well content with the trouble and expense of transporting them. His Majesty, having often pressed me to accept some employment in his court, and finding me absolutely determined to return to my native country, was pleased to give me his license to depart, and honored me with a letter of recommendation under his own hand to the Emperor of Japan. He likewise presented me with 444 large pieces of gold, this nation delighting in even numbers, and a red diamond, which I sold in England for 1,100 pounds. On the 6th of May, 1709, I took a solemn leave of His Majesty and all my friends. This prince was so gracious as to order a guard to conduct me to Glangwinstald, which is a royal port to the southwest part of the island. In 6 days, I found a vessel ready to carry me to Japan, and spent 15 days in the voyage. We landed at a small port town called Zamoshi, situated on the southeast part of Japan. The town lies on the western point, where there is a narrow strait leading northward into a long arm of the sea, upon the northwest part of which Yedo, the metropolis, stands. At landing, I showed the custom-house officers my letter from the King of Lugnag to His Imperial Majesty. They knew the seal perfectly well. It was as broad as the palm of my hand. The impression was a king lifting up a lame beggar from the earth. The magistrates of the town, hearing of my letter, received me as a public minister. They provided me with carriages and servants, and bore my charges to Yedo, where I was admitted to an audience, and delivered my letter, which was opened with great ceremony, and explained to the emperor by an interpreter, who then gave me notice by His Majesty's order, that I should signify my request, and whatever it were, it should be granted for the sake of his royal brother of Lugnag. The interpreter was a person employed to transact affairs with the Hollanders. He soon conjectured by my countenance that I was a European, and therefore repeated His Majesty's commands in Low Dutch, which he spoke perfectly well. I answered, as I had before determined, that I was a Dutch merchant, shipwrecked in a very remote country, where I had traveled by sea and land to Lugnag, and then took shipping for Japan, where I knew my countrymen often traded, and with some of these I hoped to get an opportunity of returning into Europe. I therefore most humbly entreated His royal favor to give order that I should be conducted safely to Nangasak. On the 9th of June, 1709, I arrived at Nangasak, after a very long and troublesome journey. I soon fell into the company of some Dutch sailors belonging to the Amboina of Amsterdam, a stout ship of 450 tons. I had lived long in Holland, pursuing my studies at Leyden, and I spoke Dutch well. The seamen knew whence I came last. They were curious to inquire into my voyages and course of life. I made up a story as short and probable as I could, but concealed the greatest part. I knew many persons in Holland. I was able to invent names for my parents, whom I pretended to be obscure people in the province of Gelderland. I would have given the captain what he pleased to ask for my voyage to Holland, but understanding I was a surgeon, he was contented to take half the usual rate, on condition that I would serve him in the way of my calling. Nothing happened worth mentioning in this voyage. We sailed with a fair wind to the Cape of Good Hope, where we stayed only to take in fresh water. On the 10th of April, 1710, we arrived safe at Amsterdam, having lost only 3 men by sickness on the voyage, and a 4th, who fell from the foremast into the sea not far from the coast of Guinea. From Amsterdam I soon set sail for England in a small vessel belonging to that city. On the 16th of April, we put in at the Downs. I landed the next morning, and saw once more my native country, after an absence of 5 years and 6 months complete. I went straight to Redriff, where I arrived the same day at 2 in the afternoon, and found my wife and family in good health.
Copyright 1995. Dove Audio Incorporated. If you would like to receive a Dove Audio or Dove Kids catalog, please call 1-800-328-3683 or 1-800-328-DOVE.